So, it's that time again. There are so many titles that I desperately want to play at this point, and many of which have been on my backlog for what feels like decades. Will this be the year that I finally get to play Mass Effect? Unlikely. But knowing me, I'll probably find a way to dump another 50 hours into Counter-Strike. The funny thing is that I don't even really enjoy playing CS that much. It's just that there are only so many games that my friends play together, and this just happens to be one of them. With this being said, there are many games which have remained on the back burner for a while now, and while a lot of them I do still really want to play, it's sometimes difficult to partition out the time to actually experience them. Every once in a while though, there will be that one odd new release that just comes out of nowhere and completely demands all of my time, regardless of any other plans I may have made. All the classics on my bucket list can quite easily be forgotten if a newer title comes along which manages to absolutely steal all of my attention. Whether I'm captivated by the game's art style, mechanics, or the influences which it draws from, I find that sometimes a title will come by that piques my interest on all fronts, allowing for me to truly dedicate a good chunk of my time to it. Signalis just happened to be one of these games. Survival horror games typically interest me, as I've gained a lot of admiration for this genre in the past. They typically demand a certain level of engagement that other games just don't, and I definitely appreciate the more challenging nature of this type of experience. Signalis looked like a great addition to the genre, and while I do appreciate the top-down perspective as well as the sci-fi horror setting, I was actually more interested in how this game would challenge me as a player, while also finding a way to introduce an intriguing world for me to explore. So, I fast-tracked this game up the backlog, and at this point, I think I'm ready to dive into the horrific world of Signalis. This game is dark, and while it successfully pays homage to many of my favorite titles, it also finds a way to suffocate the player with its original and organically twisted world. The earlier Resident Evil games lend a large amount of influence to Signalis, but you can also find bits of Dead Space, Silent Hill, or even parts of a game like Soma within it. I'll explain these connections a bit more soon enough. However, I found that many of the games which influence Signalis introduce a certain levity throughout their playtime which this one absolutely forgoes. There are no jokes, not really any supporting characters, and very few optimistic moments throughout this game. Signalis commits itself to being oppressively dark, and I find that it's much more of a focused title for it. It lacks that digestibility factor that games like Resident Evil possess, but its more refined tone allows for it to feel incredibly distinct. Whether it's this game's commitment to body horror or its meditation on individuality or loneliness, I always found that Signalis remained uniquely bleak in a way that I haven't quite experienced before. This game uses many different avenues to unsettle the player, and it does this without ever needing many of the more obvious means of doing so. The horror of Signalis comes from a feeling of dread building up inside of you, and not from jump scares or loud noises either, but from tense music or hostile and claustrophobic environments. This game indirectly tells the player from the very start that there isn't going to be a light at the end of this tunnel, and there are not many games I've experienced quite like this. It's a pretty interesting horror game, and it's one which I thought would be fun to discuss today. This has been my brief introduction to Signalis, but before I move on to my thoughts on this game, I think that it would most likely be beneficial for me to describe exactly what it is and how it operates. It takes an extremely unique approach, but I could also see certain aspects of this game leaving room for confusion, especially to those who haven't fully experienced this title. So, what exactly is this game? Let's start with the obvious. I may have said this already, but Signalis in many ways feels like a spiritual successor to Resident Evil. The weapons, safe rooms, inventory mechanics, traversal, enemy designs, and puzzles all feel like they could have been ripped straight out of Resident Evil 1 or 2. On top of this, the aiming can be difficult, and your motion feels quite limited, especially when engaging with enemies in close quarters. You never quite know what's behind a door when you're navigating, and sometimes your overconfidence could cost you a few health supplies. The environments you move through are dark and inhospitable, and along with this, the resource economy can be quite strict. This game encourages the player to save their resources, and you always have to ask yourself if it's better to use an item now or to hold on to it for later. If any of this seems familiar, it's because these are all elements which Signalis shares with Resident Evil. There were times where I almost felt deja vu over the classic horror series, especially within this game's combat design and enemy encounters. In fact, many of the attack patterns and enemy placements within this game pretty much allowed for me to feel like I was navigating Spencer Mansion again, and the flare gun felt particularly in line with the grenade launcher from the first title. Just to put the nail in the coffin, you can kill enemies, but they'll just come right back. Unless, you guessed it, they're burnt. And flares do take up inventory space, so you better think about what you really need on you at all times. The particular way which this title restricts your inventory space feels very in line with older survival horror experiences, and backtracking for consumables was definitely a prominent aspect of this game. However, one thing I will say is that if you played any of the more recent survival horror titles, Signalis wearing these influences on its sleeve should not really come across as surprising. Many newer titles from this genre have also ripped mechanics from these earlier ones, and Signalis definitely does it with a certain level of finesse which other games just don't. The retro-style gameplay was implemented quite well, and while there were very few innovations made on the mechanical side of this game, I actually think that Signalis may have been much better off for not trying to reinvent the wheel. This game tries its best to constantly challenge the player, and sticking to the roots of this genre definitely allowed for the developers to do this. Also, while there may be a lack of mechanical innovation in this game, Signalis found a way to create a strong identity for itself on other fronts, as aesthetically and narratively, this game is absolutely one of a kind. The top-down perspective may not have changed the way we play this type of game all that much, but it absolutely allows for Signalis to stand out stylistically speaking. So much attention was given to this game's art design, and it was definitely beneficial to pull back that camera and give the player a much larger field of view over their surroundings. It enables us to observe the painstakingly crafted environments, while also allowing us to feel somewhat small in the face of our surroundings. The music does an excellent job reinforcing this feeling, as many of the songs bring a sort of emotional resonance, which helps establish this idea of the predicament being much larger than the playable character. Another thing that I want to say about this experience is that Signalis never tries to limit itself to just one camera perspective. As for several moments throughout this game, the player will enter the first-person view for many of its more cinematic moments. These segments added a lot of diversity to the presentation of this game's narrative, and even though there was never combat during these more scripted sections, they did allow for the player to experience a different perspective within this game's universe. These first-person moments contributed to the mystique of this game, and Signalis always tried its best to implement an air of mystery surrounding its narrative. Just from the nature of this video, I won't be diving too deep into this game's story, and I'll explain why soon enough, but it revolves around this interplanetary civilization where replicas are commonplace in assisting their human counterparts. The protagonist is one of these replicas, and in many ways, this character's identity crisis shares parallels with similar stories. Think something like Soma. But to call Soma a direct influence may be an overstatement. Most of this game's narrative comes in the form of world building, done through various diaries and notes. But along with this, much of what you learn about this game's story isn't really explicitly told to the player. You don't really need to read in order to come to the conclusion that this facility isn't operating as intended. And while you do get a better understanding of the universe through these various diaries, this game always tries its best to be as ambiguous as possible. I've already explained that this game wears many of its influences on its sleeve, and narratively, Signalis takes a keen interest in earlier Cthulhu works, and it remains particularly interested in the King in Yellow specifically. While I haven't read this book, I have heard that many of its short stories share many of the same story beats as something like Signalis. However, I will say that I did feel a ton of the original Dead Space's influence throughout this game. The enemy design remains very similar to that of the Necromorphs, and generally speaking, the virus which is present in Signalis definitely reminded me of the one created by the Marker. This is about all I can say about this game's narrative before entering spoiler territory, as this game's non-linear writing finds a way to give way more exposition in the latter half of the game. In general though, I found it to be quite good, albeit confusing, but it was definitely fun to investigate just what this world was about. After I completed Signalis, I thought it would be interesting to see how it was critically received. And one thing I did notice about this game is that there's a general lack of consensus surrounding its flaws. While many outlets praised some of the same elements I have, there was never a general understanding of what this game could have improved upon. Some journalists decided to criticize the combat of this game, stating that it was just far too janky for it to feel that good, while others just flat out said that this game was too difficult. I don't really find myself agreeing with either of these takes at all, as I find that many of these criticisms pertain to the same elements which generally add tension to this style of game. I did find that the controller inputs were slightly more difficult to deal with than the keyboard and mouse controls, but I don't really think that this impacted my experience with Signalis at all. However, I still absolutely have some of my own criticisms. Quality-wise, all of the environments were well designed and intriguing in their own right. They are grim in a way that feels extremely organic to this game, and this adds to the horror of this world perfectly. However, I generally feel that there could have been a larger variety between many of the area designs within this game. Dark corridors and living spaces within these massive complexes compose a large portion of this game's environments, and while you do leave these areas once or twice, this game finds a way to always return you to similar feeling regions. I can only remember one zone that felt like a drastic departure from the living spaces you find yourself exploring early on in the experience, and I would love to have seen a bit more interesting areas to explore. I would like to call back to Dead Space for a moment, as I feel like the design of this game tries its best to create a similar cohesion to something like the Ishimura. The first Dead Space was, for the most part, limited to the Ishimura space station, and while you traverse through its various sections, you will find that a lot of them feel quite at home for this derelict space station. Now, Signalis tries its best to exhibit a similar level of cohesion between its areas, but generally speaking, I found that Dead Space did this in a much more interesting manner than Signalis. The first Dead Space, while consistent in its environmental design, has much stronger payoffs in the form of zones which feel truly distinct within the experience as a whole. While Signalis tries its best to do something similar, it didn't ever find a way to truly differentiate the environments in a manner which burned itself into my brain like the moments from Dead Space. Now, I would like to mention that this game was primarily developed by 2 people, and while also not having anything near that AAA Dead Space EA budget. So, while I did feel that this game lacked the environmental variation which its influences may have had, I absolutely didn't expect any high-budget set pieces or environments that felt like a whole other world. However, I will say that after this game's success, I'm quite interested to see what Rose Studio can do for their next title. After this point, I only really have one more criticism for this game. But to be quite honest, it's probably the one which I feel hurt this experience the most. While this game tries its best to create some high-stakes encounters and interesting boss fights, I sadly found that the pacing of this game's combat and set-piece moments felt somewhat off. There are very few bosses, and I did find that there were moments throughout this experience where I thought the game was gearing up for the showdown with a larger enemy that just never happened. There's also something off regarding the weapons and how they are given to the player. There are many guns which I discovered far too late into the experience for the player to even consider using them as their weapon of choice. And along with this, there are very few weapons that feel completely unique to Signalis. I also found that many of the consumables were dropped just a bit too frequently, and I always had like 10 auto-injectors on me at the same time, which I just never used. And if you didn't know, auto-injectors are probably the most valuable consumable in this game. The good news is that none of these issues are that impactful to my enjoyment of this game. And in the end, I would still absolutely recommend this experience to anybody who seemed interested. This is all I really have to say about Signalis. I had a great time playing it, and I am very happy that I got the opportunity to talk about this title. I also happen to be quite glad that my backlog is looking a bit lighter now. I have been neck deep in my Shadow of the Erdtree playthrough, so I think I'm probably just going to head back to Elden Ring at this point. Thank you to everybody who took the time to watch this video, and I hope that you enjoyed it. My next one should be out pretty soon, so if you're interested, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching.